Welcome, good afternoon, and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. On behalf of our President and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, we're very thankful that all of you are with us today, and we're very thankful to have our special guests with us from UNDP. Before we begin, just a little bit about the Wilson Center. Congress established the Wilson Center some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. What that means is that we are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. Our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations for policymakers. One key area where policymakers need those recommendations revolves around Asia and the Pacific. As we know, Asia is the world's most populous and economically vibrant region, but it is also not immune from the challenges facing global growth, including the technology revolution, environmental sustainability, and political uncertainties. As we know, last February, the White House announced its Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, Canada, UK, and the European Union, and a few other countries have their own strategies on how to deal with the Indo-Pacific. And rightly so, the U.S. rightfully recognizes that the Indo-Pacific is vital to our security and prosperity. And which is why we're very excited for today's conversation. I want to congratulate UNDP for the release of its latest report on the need to boost human capital in Asia. I feel that this is sometimes a topic that doesn't get enough attention, so thank you very much for putting this report together. The UNDP report, titled New Directions for Human Development in Asia and the Pacific, provides insights not only into what countries across the region are facing, but also how to invest in people as the most valuable resource in Asia. While the Asia and the Pacific area accounts for 2/3 of global economic growth, income and wealth disparities are worsening, particularly in South Asia, where the wealthiest 10% control over half of the region's total income. With that in mind, we're excited to host the UNDP's Assistant Secretary General, Connie Wignaraja, I hope I got that right, who is also the UNDP's Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. She brings over 25 years of experience of the UN mission and UNDP's role in the Sustainable Development Agenda. As a former official from USAID, thank you so much for your service. This is an area that needs more attention on a global scale. And she has also previously served as the Acting Assistant Administrator and Director for the Bureau of Management Services and as Special Advisor to the UNDP Administrator. So thank you so much. Welcome to the Wilson Center, and I'm going to give the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Eddie, for hosting us here, and to the colleagues at the Wilson Center and Ambassador Green. And I'm going to use about 12 or 10 slides to just highlight some of the issues that we brought up in what is now the first regional human development report after about 8-9 years. And you can imagine since the last one how much has changed in the Asia Pacific. So if I can go to the next, yeah. I'm going to take us through these 3 query functions, if you wish, and get to where we are first today. So next. Now, we all know the remarkable improvements and progress. And here I will just use one example, which people don't refer to often. But just in the last couple of decades, you saw the doubling of Asians completing tertiary education. So you can see where this region is heading in in the next few years as well, and investments in post-secondary and tertiary education just continuing to move up. If I put that up with life expectancy, health indicators, income, then you're seeing human development. It probably in the world was the largest hike in human development in our index, which was a 19-point hike when we calculated it for the region. Now, it is simultaneously a story then of the fact that this progress has ridden on the back of growing disparities and inequalities. So other than the 10% controlling half of the region's income, as Eddie mentioned, you still have about 185 million people who live in extreme poverty. And 1 billion, if you count that as societally poor, who live on less than half of the median income. Then on top of that, if you look at the debt distress of countries today and where the burden of that is being carried, you can see again the disparities at that larger macro level as well. And this is a region that on average gets hit 6 times more with natural disasters a year than any other. In fact, it's 3 times more than any part of Africa, and certainly double that of what we see in the Caribbean, if you look at what's going on in the Pacific. So the need for new directions, I would say we categorized it, if you wish, into 3 areas. One, we looked at unmet aspirations. And here, it's interesting that about half of our countries, or a little less, have fast aging populations. And the other half has significantly young populations. And that particularly in South Asia. So if you take China and East Asia as aging fast, and this is a story of aging, growing old before growing rich. And then you look at South Asia, where it's a very big youth bulge. Then you're looking at their aspirations as on both ends not being met. Second, we look at heightened human insecurity, and here we've looked at political conflict and the democratic backsliding in the region. We've looked at job insecurity as a key characteristic of how people self-assess their sense of insecurity, and the growing kind of emotional and mental well-being going down in many countries, particularly among a young demographic. And third, we looked at a very turbulent future with the existential threat of climate crisis, now not something in the future, but that's with us today. So that was a context in which we then said, how do we together make a new future? And so the 3 questions on the future that we asked was, can we be better at mainstreaming human development and really unpacking what that means today? We asked about recalibrating growth strategies, growth very much needed to expand human development, but what kind of growth? And then, do we have the guts to make this change happen? So those were the 3 questions then that we took on. So if I look at that first one of mainstreaming human development, which Amartya Sen and Mahbubul Haq have been talking about since 1990 and writing about, we looked at what has worked and what hasn't worked in this very diverse region, and whether there is genuine intentionality of putting the welfare of both current generations and future generations at the heart of development approaches. And you can see that very few countries have held that consistently over time. You also see that there are large tracts of people who have been left out of progress altogether, whether that's sometimes intentional due to discriminatory practices or sometimes just unintentional, mostly because of the remoteness in that latter category, and hence the cost of reaching some of these populations. But certainly the piece on injustice and those intentionally left out point to a lot of discriminatory policies that our countries have been carrying for decades on the books, let alone in their constitutions. And then the report draws on addressing ways to enlarge people's choices, including improving their sense of human security and protecting their nature's assets with which a large part of the population live, which means we've got to really redraw what it means to grow in this kind of situation. Now, if I take that, the recalibrating growth strategies, here I would say there were 3 or 4 issues that I'd like to put to your attention that's really key. And that is that we constantly refer in the report, in the second half of the report, to the right kind of growth. And if you unpack this, as we've done in the report, and if you do have a chance to read the full report and you don't have a time to read all of it, start from midway and read to the end, because that's where I find a lot of the interesting examples also from countries come through. And so the first importance, if you wish, is what type of export-led growth strategies work currently in the Asia-Pacific, because this, as you know, was a region that really took Japan's early model of export-led growth and then moved it very fast, including, of course, the large export-driven strategies of China, Vietnam, Philippines, and now India. So today, what is a competitive export-led strategy? Because you can't drop that outward-looking nature of what needs to grow the pie. The question we asked is it possible to do this in more sustainable ways? And it's interesting that in order to reach what we would call an equilibrium of competitive economies with cohesive societies, or more equal and just societies, that this previously was very much posed as in conflict with each other. And a lot of the analysis shows this is not true. In fact, yesterday or day before, it was an interesting article in the Nature journal that even looked at dissecting this, of what it would take to eradicate extreme poverty. And you see that the carbon emissions of this strategy globally is minimal. Where it really, the heat turns on, quite literally, is how do you sustain a middle-class growth, not reducing or eradicating extreme poverty, but it's the exacerbating of middle-class growth which has to turn consumption and production patterns on their head. And of course, we've known this for a long while, but very few countries have been following this pattern. Now, at the same time of keeping competitiveness in the export arena, we look at which countries have actually been moving to better domestic integration and looking at local level specializations, supporting entrepreneurship, rural infrastructure, etc. You see the shift now taking place in China post-COVID to really look at a recalibration to, while still being very outward-driven, looking at that internal value chain and investing in that much, much more closely. And one of the questions I would have for discussion is how this comes up against the fact that they're carrying a heavy domestic debt, as are many countries in the Asia-Pacific. The next was looking at pursuing new opportunities, and here the questions being raised in many of our, particularly in our Southeast Asia and South Asian countries, is are we getting out of manufacturing too fast and heading into services, which are certainly not generating the same number of jobs nor income levels that manufacturing did. So what kind of manufacturing then can take advantage of the massive technological advances that we're seeing to align to new market demands? We're still very dependent on very large agrarian agriculture bases, but the majority of our countries, and I'm not talking about the small countries like a Singapore, really lack innovation in their agricultural sectors and in then the value chains and services related to agriculture. The two growing areas, and this we saw and we are seeing in the Pacific, but also in other places, is growing the green and blue economies. And here the early winners are really going to put away the gains, but that's certainly a big area. Now, where there are still a huge gap is in the care economy or the purple economy. And the ability to scale this, the ability to maybe address a huge downfall, which is the regressions on gender disparities, unequal income. This is something where the region loses a large amount of GDP overall with not really embracing and getting a fair deal or providing a fair deal to the care economy. Jobs, if you look at all surveys coming through of young people in the Asia Pacific, the two major concerns is on the robbing of their future because of the lack of decent jobs, and the worry on climate change. It's interesting how this has shifted so much if you look at comparable surveys much earlier on. So the report unpacks what this is, and we've got about 1.3 billion young people in the informal sector. And this is an unprotected sector in most of Asia. And it certainly needs to be an area that's looked at, because the numbers are not going to change. But how do you lightly regulate it so that you at least provide protection for those in those jobs? And then you've got the big growth area of the green economy, providing increasing number of jobs. And it looks like this could be about over 200 million new jobs created in this field. That's globally. The problem is that simultaneously you're seeing that the pay scales, the income earned on those jobs, rarely match yet the income comparable to coal, oil, and gas jobs. So that's still the conundrum of when does that pick up, so it really becomes a interesting and area that really absorbs more people. Now, the last chapter of this report talks to what then would policymakers, leaders, civil society, private sector, how together do we make change happen? And it does not go into kind of radical things that everything has to stop as is and everything has to change. It first looks at what can be tweaked, what are the adjustments that can be made to existing policy levers that then have the staying power. This is our problem. In most of our countries, with the exception of one or two that don't have regular electoral cycles, every 4 or 5 years, policy shifts and swings are quite dramatic. So the staying power of policies is something that is also critical beyond the tweaks. And there are a number of country illustrations on what works, what doesn't work so well, and what really has to be then put aside to move into this new way of growing for human development. Something that we've put up very strongly or centered on relates then to the state of demographics in each country. So as I said, China with a fast aging population, India with a large youth, very young, I wouldn't even call it a youth bulge, I'd call it a kiddies bulge, very, very large. And then the fact that about 80% of the world's middle class growth is going to come from Asia in particular. So that has to be factored in to the new growth strategies. And if I just take one of those transitions, if we take energy and look at a just energy transition, currently in Asia Pacific, fossil fuel dominates and is about 85% of current energy consumption, 85%. So this is a massive transition, and how fast can this accelerate? And you can see the pushes and pulls going on right now in Dubai. Every day, the readout is more surreal than the day before. But half the world's emissions are coming from Asia, and with the large emitters over there. Now, if we keep to the Paris Agreement, that says 35% of energy consumption must be via renewables by 2030. This means for our region that the two big horses driving this cart, India and China, have to be the ones really driving the regional average. And there, what we're finding, and you see this in a smaller state in the Pacific, the interesting thing is that electricity is actually on grid for large parts of these countries, including Pacific Islands. So off-grid solutions are not necessarily what's going to happen, but the grids just cannot absorb, the current grids just cannot absorb the additional excess energy from wind and solar. So grid technology and grid solutions is going to be key to whether the energy transition can actually happen sooner rather than later. Just two more slides, and this I'm going to go. This one is just to give you a sense that at the end of the day, this growing middle class and the demographic changes is really going to redefine a lot of what we're going to be talking about in much of Asia, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. It's going to be fast, but in South Asia, it will drive about 45% of middle class growth, of global middle class growth. So you can see that if we don't shift this to a low carbon trajectory, these countries are just not going to move or make the change. Literally the last pages of the report really focus in on the governance of these reforms and where it has broken down, where it needs to move forward. And this really is forging pathways for reform and what gives it the staying power and what needs to revamp on the governance side. The focus on people right now, every survey of every country shows this, is mostly a political campaign. Very few leaders have stayed with this throughout. We saw some buck the trend during COVID and really put people first. So hopefully you are going to see some of that holding. And the education and health sectors are certainly coming through in this regard. Now, the issue of reaching the last mile is a costly affair, and we're seeing this mostly on social protection policies that are stretched absolutely thin. And with the kind of fiscal space conundrum right now, with debt distress in most countries, the question is, where's the money going to come from? With every additional dollar, let's say, really being more and more expensive to borrow, certainly for things like social protection. But for UNDP, we've come through very strong on looking at things like a basic guaranteed basic income, a universal health coverage, things that may cost more now, but certainly amortized over a period of time, certainly make a lot of sense. So beyond the energy transition, also the economic transition that links to social policy as well. And then the last slide really is also putting the capabilities in place for the kind of institutional reforms that are needed to deliver. So even if political leaders come and go, can our institutions stay the course to deliver on this? And the issues of more anticipatory policies that absorb and anticipate risk, that are able to adapt to new technologies, new information that's constantly thrown at us, or misinformation for that matter, and the agility to really be more collaborative, which is not always the case, including in looking at that kind of competition in the external domain. So the political will issue with people's greater participation and more collaborative arrangements on the economic side are areas of governance for the future that we unpack in quite some detail in the report. I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you.
No, Connie, thank you so much. And again, congratulations to you and your UNDP team for this very insightful report that has laid out some of the key issues for growth and what you call the systemic reset and what a successful growth model should be. There's a lot of food for thought about how we move forward from the East Asian miracle. What is the East Asian miracle for the 21st century? You mentioned how Asian countries had followed the Japanese model until the early 1990s. We've seen that hit a wall, but at the same time, what's interesting is we've seen some of those practices that were seen as negatives in advanced economies, such as industrial policy, actually being embraced here in the United States and across the industrialized countries of the world. And so we also see the rise of protectionism, but at the same time in Asia there is a firm belief not just in trade and export-led growth, but interdependence more broadly. And there is this need to reconsider what growth is and how we define and move forward with social inclusion. I am really excited to be able to introduce two speakers with us who will enlighten us on some of these driving economic issues. First of all, here joining us in this room is Professor Shahid Yousaf, who is the chief economist with the Growth Dialogue. He is also a professor at George Washington University's Business School and an adjunct professor at SAIS. He is also, I should point out, the co-author of Chapter 4 of this report, which is entitled Recalibrating Growth Strategy. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing some of your insights on this. And joining us online is Professor Homi Karas, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Sustainable Development, which is part of the Global Economic part of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. He is a scholar and a practitioner. He has advised the UN Secretary General on the post-2015 development agenda, amongst many other policy crafting positions. And he's also a co-author of The Rise of the Global Middle Class, which was published this year. But before I turn to Shahid first, I would like to remind our audience who is joining us online that as you see this being broadcast, there is a box. You can submit your questions. If you could reach out to us, that would be great. So with that, Shahid, maybe I could turn to you to talk about some of the key findings of Chapter 4 on recalibrating growth, and in particular this challenge, since we are in the midst of COP28, this challenge of competition and cooperation in the from the in energy and environmental sustainability landscape.
Okay, thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me here. It was it was very thrilling to write this report, and there's a great deal of back and forth with the various authors of the report. So I had a great time doing so. As everybody knows, among all the regions of the world, East Asia's, or rather Asia's growth prospects are probably, arguably, the brightest. And as it develops and it pursues export-led growth, it's going to have to give a high priority to minimizing the environmental consequences, to make sure that the natural capital of the region is not dissipated in the process. So what will it all entail? For many of those countries, perhaps most of the countries, there's a need to industrialize. There'll be a need to urbanize. Many of them have at a very early stage of urbanization. They need to build so-called resilient infrastructures. They need to increase energy supplies. They need to meet, in particular, the material consumption needs of the middle class, which is going to be really critical, as you mentioned. And many of these countries will have a growing population, and that too will have an environmental consequence. So what are they going to try and do about this? I think the greening of development, or this whole process in this export-led venture going forward, will entail at least 4 priorities. There are many more, but let me just focus on those 4. The first is, I think, an increased reliance on renewable energy. I mean, this is a commonplace now, and every country is trying to do a little bit there. Second is the decarbonization of industry and transport. Third is, and this is particularly important, I think, is the dematerialization of consumption. And the fourth is the reduction of emissions from agriculture, which are non-trivial. I mean, most people very often tend to ignore them, but they are not insignificant. Now, China leads the rest of Asia and, in fact, the rest of the world when it comes to renewable energy. It has sort of set the pace for other countries, and has been quite remarkable in terms of putting solar panels, wind turbines, other things, developing a smart grid. And a lot of this has had to do with its ability to create or internalize the entire supply chain for renewable energy. And by internalizing the supply chain and in particular developing the scale economies, it has brought down the costs and therefore made it possible to expand, for instance, solar panels and solar fields to the extent that they have managed to do so. Other countries are moving much more slowly. If you just look at renewable sources, excluding hydropower, everybody is under 10%. Indonesia, surprisingly, is only 1%. And as you pointed out, coal remains important, other fossil fuels as well. 80 to 82% of all energy is still being derived from there. And countries like India and China are increasing mining and coal production and the creation of coal-fired plants. So, each of these has a life expectancy of 30 years. So some of this use of coal emissions are getting locked in, and so one has to move quickly. Second thing which I've been working on quite a lot is the decarbonization of industry and transport. And here the problem is quite challenging. The two solutions that are on offer, one is electrification. The electrification of some of the most energy-intensive industries, which is steel, cement, petrochemicals, paper and pulp, glass. So that's one of the things. The other option, which is being pursued, is the use of hydrogen. Liquefied hydrogen. Both of these are in quite early stages. In China, which is doing the most in this area, there's a lot of effort going into this, a lot of innovation, a lot of research, and a lot of incentives are being provided to industry to try and develop this capability. And there are pilot plants. But we have a long ways to go. There's not much progress made as yet, and China is the leader. Every other country is way, way behind. So that's one effect. What countries are also trying to do is demineralization. And here again, this is an early stage of development. So we can see that with the demand for solar panels and electric vehicles, you're going to need a great deal more mineral inputs. In particular, if you look at an electric vehicle, it has more mineral content than the ICE vehicle which it is trying to replace. And some of the items that go into this car are, rare earths, lithium, nickel, and other things, which are going to have to be mined, which are going to have to be refined. The refining is very polluting and very energy intensive. So here's an important consideration. Other things which are happening, substituting rare minerals for others. That's ongoing. There's a lot of research in that area. One hopes for the best. Then there's this whole question of whether you can lightweight products. Yes, that's being attempted also. And then, there are many other things that are in the works. Emissions from agriculture. This will require significant changes, particularly in diet. And I don't know how that's going to come about. But if we are going to consume meat and rice, you're going to have, going forward, great deal of use of agricultural land to produce the foodstuffs for cattle and pigs and other things, and you're going to have significant emissions. So there is a need to first consider what one can be done about the diet, especially for a growing middle class. But in addition, there's also the need to consider how much nitrogen fertilizer is used. China uses a huge amount of fertilizer. It releases nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more contributes to global warming than carbon dioxide. Okay, last. So what do I pin my hopes on? There's a lot of discussion of policies like carbon pricing, emissions trading. I'm sure this is being discussed at COP28 as we speak. I pin a lot of hope on technological change, which reduces mineral consumption, which reduces energy emissions. There are, again, lots of incentives being provided by various countries. Again, China is the leader in this area. Thousands and thousands of patents being issued. Every time I pick a copy of Nature or Science or any of the others, I'm heartened. But then I look at the world and I'm somewhat disheartened. So another thing which can be done is reducing fossil fuel subsidies, 1.3 trillion directly, 7.6 trillion if you take everything else into account. The report spells these out. One other factor which has to be considered is as we move from brown economies or economies that are, intensive in brown industries towards green industries, you'll need to retrain workers. The green industry will require a different set of skills. That means that people who have worked in brown industries will have some difficulty transferring to green industries. And as one can see in the United States today with the UAW negotiations, people are worried. They're worried that they won't have the skills and they'll be unemployed. Anyway, the report, as I said, unpacks this, goes into quite a bit of detail. Huge challenges lie ahead.
Thank you so much. You've really laid a lot of issues that I do want to come back to. But before I do, I'd like to turn to Homi. And we've already mentioned the challenges for the middle class, everything from changing their diet to worker retraining and social inclusion and the like. I'm hoping that you could expand a bit about the challenges facing the aspirations of the global middle class, and what do we mean by a global middle class, and what kind of aspirations are realistic in this region that has competing interests, everything from competition for resources, competition for real estate, competition for food as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Shihoko, and thanks for inviting me to give some comments and observations on on this report. And before I get into I'll talk a bit about the middle class, because I have just done a book on the rise of the global middle class, where we look at many of these issues in detail, including whether the broadening of the middle class is compatible with sustainability. Thankfully, the answer is yes, and I'll get into that a little bit. But I wanted to start by just saying one of the things that comes out of this report, comes out of the presentation that we heard, is how fundamental human capital is to any form of advancement of prosperity. And when we think about the middle class is based on its human capital foundations. It's based on education. It's based on access to jobs. When we look at the region and the reason why Asia has actually done so well, I think it is because of its very strong emphasis on human capital, and the numbers that were cited about the doubling of Asians with tertiary education. We can quibble about issues of quality. Certainly Shahid has thoughts on that. But nevertheless, I think it gives us pause to think that prospects actually remain quite good for the region. And if you look at the short-run prospects, this is a region which is ticking along at something like 5% per annum growth, according to the IMF. It's got very high investment rates, close to 40%, very high savings rates. It's not running big current account deficits. So it's a region where, in many ways, the economic prospects lie within its own power to achieve. So I think the first big thing to recognize is that the big new growth strategy is going to be growth without increases in greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a real possibility, for example, that China, for all the building of new coal power plants and this and that, may be pretty much at peak GHG emissions already this year. Maybe it'll go up by a little bit next year and the year after. But in terms of the aggregate amount of CO2 equivalent emissions, there's already a delinking in China of growth and emissions. China will grow, 5%, something like that going forward, with no growth in emissions. And this is something that started a while back with the Philippines in the region. So this idea that now we can have economic growth and prosperity without an increase in GHG emissions is one that I hope in the region will become as famous for promoting this idea as it has been in the past for its, the demonstration of export-oriented growth. So the new Asian growth story is going to be a growth story of growth without GHG emissions. A lot of this, one thing that we haven't talked about as yet is the role that urbanization, city planning is going to play in achieving this kind of growth. As Shahid said, this is a region which is still got many people moving to cities, mostly to secondary cities rather than to metropolises. The quality of city planning, management, etc., is going to be absolutely fundamental to the ability to manage future emissions. In essence, if you get city planning wrong, then it's really expensive to try to retrofit and get it right, and all kinds of things from urban congestion to other issues on the sustainability side basically become very difficult to deal with. So I would say that having cities becoming much more sustainably designed is an absolute priority. And of course, cities are the places where you have agglomeration economies. They still exist in Asia. You're still getting productivity growth from the expansion of cities. So that's going to be important. And cities are going to be the place where the middle class largely resides. So this brings me back to this whole issue of, the middle class. And one of the things that I think is often unrecognized is that the middle class is both the cause of many of the environmental problems that we see, but also the solution. So it's the cause for obvious reasons. Middle class mass consumption consumes resources, consumes energy, people move about, they take, plane trips, all of which we know contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, and their demand for food and other products leads to the destruction of nature. Shahid mentioned agriculture. Usually these numbers are in terms of agriculture and land use, and certainly in Asia, far and away the biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is actually more on the land use side, and it's the deforestation of some of the large remaining natural forests, especially in the Papua forest in both PNG and in the Indonesian side. And all of that is driven partly by the demand for food, but very largely the demand for feed, as Shahid said. So why is the middle class the solution? It's because it is, I think, the middle class that's been pressuring governments, including in China, to actually be far more proactive in halting fossil fuels. I think that we have long underestimated the negative health effects of fossil fuel emissions. It's very obvious with carbon particulates, but there are many other kinds of particulates as well. The middle class has realized it. Nobody in Delhi is going to trade off. What's the point of being middle class if you can't actually go outside, and if your kids all get asthma from breathing the air and you have to close down the city? So these things have become obvious. They've become quite clear. They were definite drivers of why China has started to move so fast in reducing its emissions. And hopefully that message will come through to the rest of the countries. Similarly, I think the middle class is a big proponent of preservation of nature. And increasingly, you see movements, all across the region, including in the Pacific, where the movements are more to do with marine preservation, because they understand that tourism, which is such an important part of the jobs scenario and other scenarios, these are big income earners. So I think that it's going to be this kind of middle class pressure on governments to move towards sustainability that will hopefully help to encourage policymakers to put the region on a more sustainable level. I think we have examples of where you don't have to sacrifice growth, certainly in the medium term, for the benefits of improved sustainability. We're already starting to see, I mean, the new technologies that cheap energy will bring about can be considerable. It would be unthinkable for China, for example, to leapfrog into becoming world-class automotive producers if it wasn't for EVs. The fact of the matter is that EVs have far fewer moving parts and don't require that same degree of historical, mechanical engineering traditions in firms to be able to make a breakthrough. And that's why China has now emerged as a leader in this field. Otherwise, it would never have been able to compete with the likes of Toyota or Mercedes. So lots of opportunities, I think, in the region, lots of regionalization. Yes, exports might be slowing, but that's often exports to the rest of the world. There's a lot of opportunity in the rotation of exports out of China towards other countries in the region. Unfortunately, non-Asian countries aren't really sort of penetrating or denting that Asian supply chain, so it'll stay within the region, and that's one reason why the region still has fairly bright growth prospects compared to several other places in the world. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me go back to this idea of the aspirations for the middle class. I think they're actually not just limited to Asia and the Pacific. They're quite universal. And there's a great deal of anxiety here in the United States, across Europe, and of the advanced economies of Asia too, about, on the one hand, we have more expectations, but there's also this challenge of technology and the challenge of automation, the challenge of greater dependence and usage of artificial intelligence and other technologies that could, on the one hand, improve our living standards, but on the other hand, change the workforce landscape and indeed make a great many of us actually quite redundant. So I'm wondering how that fits into the Asian economy's aspirations to move up the value chain. And then the second issue that I would like to ask is about EVs. You both talked about China and environmental sustainability and their use of EV their dominance in the EV sector, which is great. There is a limit, though. There are restrictions, tariffs on the export of Chinese EVs. If it were not for those restrictions and tariffs, this country would be flooded with Chinese EVs because they are quite high quality and they're very affordable compared to a Tesla, for instance. Is that desirable, though, from a sustainability perspective? When we deal with this challenge of what actually makes the components of an EV, should we deliberately keep the prices not affordable to the middle class, or should we actually encourage greater adaptation and adoption of EVs so that there is less carbon emission? To all three of you, any of those topics. Before I turn to the floor and indeed to our online participants. Thanks.
Can I quickly just butt in and take on some of these?
Please.
So let me start with the last. Trade restrictions aren't going to solve anything. So it's bad for the middle class in the US, it's bad for sustainability, it's bad for global prosperity, and perhaps the only thing it's good for is US politics. But that's not part of at least my value set. So that's my kind of economic economist response to that part of the question. In terms of the aspirations, I think you're absolutely right. The middle class is looking for something else, something new, not just advanced economies. Middle class, there's disquiet in every, the middle class all over the world. Graduate unemployment in China is a big issue. Suicides in India are a big issue. These are not, in the world happiness surveys, these are not happy countries, even if they do have very rapidly expanding middle classes. And it would be extremely sensible for governments to think more broadly about what generates well-being amongst their populace rather than a very narrow lens on GDP growth. Thankfully, there are some places in the region like New Zealand, which I believe was the first country in the world to actually introduce mental health as one of its budget priorities. So this is starting to change in the region. So, with a little bit of foresight, I think people will come to understand that there are, in fact, many other issues. The technology change is quite new. For the last 200 years, I would say almost all technological improvements substituted what I would call the repetitive manual labor tasks and occupations. This new generation of AI is starting to possibly threaten cognitive, non-repetitive, more creative tasks. That's why it's not terribly surprising that the Hollywood writers went out on strike. One doesn't usually think of writers as being the people going out on strike. Typically in the past, it would have been unions in car companies. So that's something new. The only thing I would say about, and I don't think any of us has a really good idea of how this will play out. But one thing that we do know is that the speed with which technology is diffusing in developing countries is still quite slow. So this may well be an issue for our grandchildren. It's not going to be an issue for us and probably not for our children. So I think sometimes the fears of these kinds of technologies are somewhat overblown. The bigger issue, I think, with the middle class aspirations is that the expectations are, if you want to be in the middle class, you have to work very long hours. I think as a kind of a norm, those types of arguments are just wrong. There is no empirical evidence that suggests that for typical middle class, let me call them more administrative, more cognitive types of tasks, that more hours equals more productivity. And all of the big, large-scale empirical experiments that have been done, such as in Iceland, seem to suggest the reverse, that you can cut the number of hours worked without any loss in productivity. So productivity measured per person as opposed to per hour. So I think that there's, again, scope for change in the expectations of what one expects from a so-called salaryman or a middle-class administrative worker to catch up to the reality that people no longer do manual labor, where it's very clear that if you work longer hours, you do get more productivity. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. Shahid? Yes. You can just, yeah.
Okay, so just on make 2 points here. One is with regard to what Homi said about the middle class's demand for a better environment. So the demand for a less polluted environment, as in the case of China or India or elsewhere. And my sense is that when push comes to shove and you have to trade off growth against environmental pollution, what I see happening is growth wins out, because the middle class is looking for an increase in its incomes and its material welfare. And you saw that happening in China, that the moment it seemed that growth was hitting a speed bump, they immediately sort of reversed course. Coal production increased, production of electricity from coal-fired plants increased, and the government once again is turning on the taps so as to ensure that growth does not slow down. And I see the same sort of situation in, say, the United States or elsewhere. Again, if you look at where the sort of the politics are going, whether in this country or throughout Europe, again, the focus is on growth. And that's good for the middle class in some ways, but it's bad for natural capital. That natural capital is going to be sacrificed in order to satisfy the growth of the middle class, and the politics of the middle class favor that sort of direction. The second thing I'd say is about, I mean, I think you mentioned about electric vehicles and China's strength in that area, its comparative advantage, which it has built up. And the reason it has built up this comparative advantage is because Western countries, including United States, Japan, allowed a whole lot of important industries having to do with the refining of materials to migrate to China. And as a consequence, there's been a tremendous hollowing out of capability in particular areas of the US and German and other industrial sectors. Now, there is absolutely no desire on the part of Germany, United States, or any other country with a major auto industry, which is the largest employer in the manufacturing sector, to lose that industry. And therefore, even though China has shown that it can, BYD and various other producers can produce EVs more cheaply than they can in the United States or in Germany, there is absolutely no intention in the part of these countries to allow China to ride roughshod over these industries, irrespective of whether it can sell at a lower price. So what's going to happen, and that's the real politique of it, is that they are going to use tariffs to try and ensure that Chinese imports don't decimate the industry as other industries have been decimated. The fact is that industrial policy is there because people have woken up to the fact that you can have industrial hollowing going to a point at which it actually weakens economies. And so what I see happening is that the US consumer will be paying more for electric vehicles than it otherwise might, and that an enormous effort will be made to bring more of the supply chain back here. And by the way, Tesla has one of its largest factories is in Shanghai. So, you know, it can utilize their supply chain. Another interesting thing which is happening is that CATL and other Chinese manufacturers of storage batteries and batteries are putting up enormous plants in Morocco, in Germany, all over the place. So eventually you should see a kind of a flattening out of this advantage which China currently has in particular aspects of technology. And if I look at where the patents are going and so forth, I own 2 electric cars. And I'm happy to say they were manufactured in the United States. They work well. I know that over 12 years, Tesla has been having to firefight all sorts of in order to remove the bugs in its software. I would never buy a BYD car today because it will take them 10 years to remove all the bugs that Tesla has tried to remove. So I don't think we're going to be overrun by Chinese cars, as in the past one was overrun by Korean cars and Japanese cars, because the sector is much too important. Thank you.
Well, maybe 2 points from me, and thank you to Homi and Shahid for a lot of this rich conversation and debate. One is that what we've not talked about in the middle class is that certainly if I speak to Asia and the Pacific, half the middle class, even with that large growth, is still being left behind, and they're called women. And the report very closely looks at the fact that if you actually imputed the loss of women not entering the labor force or being unable to enter the labor force, and I'm not just talking about countries like Afghanistan, I'm talking in large parts of Asia and the Pacific, that could, if treated the same way as men, that could add about $4.5 trillion to that economy. So that's a huge issue. And the second point is just coming from the Pacific, these last weeks traveling around many of those islands, you can physically feel the displacement and the out-migration of young people in the Pacific. These islands are emptying out. And they're all now to be found in Australia and New Zealand and Honolulu and elsewhere. But there's a significant dearth of human capital due to climate anxiety and the feeling of a lack of opportunity in the SID. So I just wanted to add that. And a little note on Tesla. Here now, the highest rated solar panel industry is Tesla. It's interesting that they have also moved their EV capability into this area. And certainly coming recently, I was a week ago in China, looking at Tesla growing as you said, their largest plant outside the U.S. In China, and now thinking of opening up many more. This is a whole nother world being opened up. Back to you, Shihoko.
Thank you. Let me turn it over to the audience here in the room, and if you don't, any questions? No? Okay. We do actually have a question from Jerome Glenn, and he asks, essentially, he's asking, why are you focused so much on this idea of cooperation when we're actually seeing a great deal of competition in the region? Are you deliberately neglecting that the dark side of the reality in the region? So, who would like to go first?
Well, I think there's need for both cooperation to provide the public goods, and the region definitely has to take, I think, a lead in providing some of the essential public goods that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and such like, and help preserve natural capital in Indonesia, in the Papua New Guinea, and elsewhere. So here's where I think our cooperation is very important. And countries are also very active in the area of creating FTAs and sort of cooperating to maintain semblance of the multilateral trading system, which has been, eroded over the last few years. So There is an important cooperative element in this region. But in addition, there is a great deal of competition as well, because all of these countries are vying to build up their own export industries and to move up the value chain. I mean, one of the things I hear every country I go to, everyone wants to move up the value chain in everything. And therefore, there have to be some winners and losers in this. The other interesting thing which I feel is happening is the much tighter integration of almost all of the economies in the region with China. So if you look at what's happening to both exports and imports, that's where the push is. So while these countries are competing with China in one level, they are cooperating and integrating with China at the same time. And their own growth rate in the future will depend a lot more on what happens in China. China's growth rate, China's willingness to allow its middle class to increase its consumption, and China's openness to imports, which has been somewhat questionable at times. So there is cooperation, I think, happening. I think there is competition, and that competition is good. And there'll be some winners, as I say, and some countries will be less successful. I come from Pakistan, and Pakistan is having some difficulty.
Maybe just to say, this is, to us, actually watching this from somewhat of on the sidelines of whether this is going to be a race to the top or a race to the bottom. It's actually interesting to see some of the smaller countries lining up with particular specializations that can actually link to China's value chain. I think they're also in the wings hoping that both China and India open up their domestic markets, because where are you going to find this kind of scale? Much more than both these countries have, and particularly China has been very protective of its opening up its domestic market. But it's really hard to beat them at scale. So actually connecting, and that's where the cooperation comes in. You can't compete with these giants, certainly not in our region. But connecting to their value chains is where we're seeing the competition, particularly among the other South Asian and Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you. If I can ask a related question, it's actually another uncomfortable one. We're talking about recalibrating growth strategy. Part of that recalibration, rethinking, has to be about what we have held to be true in Asia to be challenged. That we have had faith in the region about interdependence and export-led growth. At the same time, we are seeing the rise of industrial policy and protectionism. How can we actually see greater hedging in the region, either at the individual country level or amongst countries, to this growing tide of deglobalization? Is there a potential to enhance domestic growth? I mean, it's easier in China than it is, say, Singapore. But are we going to see, could we see the rise of trading, not just trading blocks, but interdependence blocks to deal with some of the rising realities?
Can I take a stab at that? Since I'm just written a paper on globalization and the importance of global value chains, I'm convinced that there is absolutely no advantage to any country, including China, of stepping back from increased globalization and trade integration. For smaller countries, it would be a disaster, because no small country can be, autarkic. They cannot internalize everything. It's inconceivable. Even if you take the case of China, in the year 2000, China was a net exporter of petroleum, and it was 92% self-sufficient in agricultural products. It is currently the largest importer of energy and 65% self-sufficient in terms of grain and other products. Now I hear Xi Jinping talking about becoming more self-sufficient and food security and such things, but I don't see that really happening. What they're doing is they're buying land in different countries in order to ensure that they have the food supplies that they need. So it's just not, looking at how trade patterns are evolving, there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that countries are pulling back and that pulling back would be advantageous. There is a study by the IMF which says that if you broke up the world into several blocks and those blocks didn't really trade with each other, the loss for the global economy would be in the region of 3% of GDP. So nobody would like that. I mean, that would be an enormous setback. So while the politics and the nationalist sentiments in various countries seem to be pushing in one direction, the economic imperatives are definitely pulling in the other direction. And that if we go look into the future and we just think of what happened with COVID-19, the need to rely on broad global value chains was much clearer than was ever the case in the past. The United States would not have been able to do what it did with vaccine production, with PPEs, without being able to tap suppliers throughout the world. Borosilicate glass was not available in this country. Various kinds of polypropylene was not available here in quantity. So COVID-19 showed us the absolute necessity for countries to hang together if they are not going to hang separately.
So, Homi.
Can I just,
Yes.
Shioka, I think even though we use terms like deglobalization, it's really important to understand that globalization continues. Exports of goods will continue to grow faster than GDP, at least in the Asian region, and exports of services will continue to grow much faster than GDP. Services is a sector where the extent of trade barriers currently is, relatively speaking, quite low. So all of the digital trade that we now see is becoming possible within the region will continue. The pace of globalization may have slowed, but globalization continues. And at least from my perspective, the biggest element of globalization, which is the globalization of ideas, is actually continuing at a very rapid pace indeed. And so I'm actually quite encouraged by the ability of different countries now to access more technologies faster than they could before. But I do think it's important when we talk about deglobalization to recognize that many of the barriers that people talk about are barriers on the goods side of things. That's becoming a smaller and smaller part of the overall picture of exports.
Thank you. I think the idea of deglobalization is much more about reglobalization, almost like as we rethink supply chains. It's not simply about cost efficiency, but we still think about cost efficiency. We also add other elements to it, including resilience and sustainability, as well as the ability to have spheres of trust. So yes, I agree that this idea of globalization is certainly hardly going down, but it's just changing in its nature and it's changing in its patterns as well. Kanye, I think you wanted to add something.
I was going to say possibly the two more dark clouds. I fully agree with what both Shahid and Homi have said. Probably two really tough things to crack. One on the carbon side, which is a very hard to abate sector, which is transport. So the shipping and air freight sectors are still very slow to turn, and the ability to do this and make it a much lighter carbon footprint would also really help in greening globalization, so to speak. But the second that casts a shadow, and this is to do with the politics of where you find politicians able to whip up a lot of anti-globalization anxieties and fears, etc., is the larger and larger numbers of dislocated people and the displacement, whether that's due to conflicts, whether that's due to climate shocks, and that suddenly becomes the face of globalization that causes a lot of local anxieties in many locations. So addressing these two, I've just chosen two illustrations, if you wish, one more emotive and the other technology-driven, but certainly will have a big say also on how the new globalization moves forward.
Just a couple of points. One is having to do with electrification. A great deal is made about how everything could be electrified, and therefore we would have, if electricity was generated by renewable sources, that all of a sudden there would be a solution to the many problems we face with GHG emissions. But only 28% of primary energy is from electricity currently. So, you know, the vast majority of our power consumption comes from other sources. So the question is, how does one chip away at that huge overhang of other sources? So I think that's going to be a tough nut for countries to crack, even as electrification proceeds and more industries use electricity. The other one is on globalization. There's a very interesting paper came out in Journal of Economic Perspectives on various measures of globalization. So in value terms, globalization seems to have plateaued. In the participation on global value chains, globalization seems to have flattened. But when you look at trade in weight terms, in terms of distance traveled, it seems to be continuing to go up. So what seems to be happening is, in value terms, seems to be stagnating. But when you see how much volume is being shipped to distant places and what's the content of that, that seems to be continuing to go up. And it seems to me that there's been some change in the composition. So fewer high-value manufactured items are being are crossing borders, but many other bulk items are going longer distances. It's a recent paper and came out 3 months ago. Yeah. Very curious.
If you could, I'm so sorry, if you could use the microphone.
Okay. I missed the first probably 10, 15 minutes of the presentation. But one of the things that is mentioned, but there's a dance that occurs that goes around it when you're looking at the things that are going to be creating the change and drive the manufacturing and the economy. Climate change, health, agriculture, food security, how you utilize your youth population, that workforce, women population as a workforce, how you looking at, from a health standpoint, you mentioned the aspects of mental health and suicides. That's a large aspect of what's going on worldwide, regardless of what's happening. So you're looking at land, when you talk about cooperation versus competition, land, water, that's going to be the thing that's going to drive where everybody goes, where everybody live, where everybody occupy. So if you can address that from the aspect of human development and the economy.
Thank you very much for your comments. I think the points that you raised have certainly been discussed not just here, but in the report itself as well. And I absolutely agree that the social inclusion, women, all of these issues are fundamental to ensuring sustainable growth in the region, and this report actually does focus a great deal on the development of human capital. But at the same time, we are reaching towards the end of our conversation today. I'd like to just ask each of our three speakers to summarize in less than a minute about what you're hopeful for in the Asia-Pacific region. As we find all of these challenges, where is the energy, the drive going to be coming from? Let me start firstly with Homi.
Well, thank you. Look, the last comment and observation, I think, was just a really eloquent way of saying that we understand that we need to have progress on a lot of these different dimensions. I think they're articulated as a set of sustainable development goals. When we think about human development, whether we think about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, or whether we think about gender equality. In many ways, they are interlocking issues. And I think that one of the great challenges for us and for the region is, as we come to address these things, is not to get too hung up on one issue at the expense of the other, but to recognize that making progress on a broad front on the SDGs is really the way forward. And I think if the region can do that, then it'll be very well positioned to actually make a contribution, not just for its own citizens, but also, as I said, as an example of how development need not be sustainable development need not involve a trade-off between so-called growth or incomes and prosperity. It's possible that there's a trade-off in the very short run, as Shahid said, but to be honest, what gives me some hope and optimism is I no longer see there being a significant trade-off in the medium to long run, and it'll be great if the region can demonstrate that.
Thank you. Shahid.
Okay, I pin my hopes on technology. And I believe that with these artificial generative intelligence based on deep neural networks, that we're going to be able to have tremendous achievements. There are major downsides. I fully recognize them. I'm hopeful that regulatory intervention will tamp down the downsides and magnify the upsides of artificial generative intelligence. But I do think it could make an enormous difference and that it will help us tackle many of the problems. Relatedly, synthetic biology and quantum computing are going to make huge differences to what we can achieve and how we can tackle the really, really big problems that lie ahead for the world. But relatedly, and this will be important, is that state capability must be built up in countries which do not have that state capabilities to deliver policies and services. Some do, and they are, I think, managing to deliver some of this, and many do not. And the many that do not are really worrisome that how weak they are. I've worked a lot on South Africa, for example, and I'm fearful of seeing that happen in other countries as well, what is happening there. But really the bright spot is how much scientific progress is being made and how many solutions there are to our many problems that one reads about and one hopes to see translated into real life and action in the years ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Connie, you have the final word.
Thank you. I would put my bet on human capabilities. And hopefully we outrun and outshine even the great technological advances. But I think it's that will show us that progress can actually happen without these large disparities that we see today, and that progress can happen without the large carbon footprint that we see today. And that progress needs the type of capable societies that then have more civic engagement and people's engagement for the greater public good. Otherwise, we're really literally shooting ourselves in the foot. So, taking that last comment, it is that broad-based lift of human development and human aspirations that meet that. That is where my bet would be.
Great. Thank you. So with that note of cautious optimism, thank you all so much for joining us here today, either in person or online. I do want to thank our speakers, Connie, Shahid, and Homi, for joining us. And I would be remiss if I did not thank my colleagues from the UNDP for reaching out to us to allow us to have this discussion. And finally, my thanks to my colleagues here at the Wilson Center. I get to be in the limelight, but it takes a village. Thank you to Mary Ratliff, John Tyler, Casey Breitenbeck, Catherine Kramer, and of course, our superb intern, Makdam Shah. So thank you again. See you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.